We have some good news on the economic front today, kind of. The AP reports U.S. employers added a solid 223,000 jobs in June, and the unemployment rate fell to 5.3%, a 7-year low. Okay, so far, so good. Can't find anything to disagree with there or anything that's negative there. They continue. The numbers reflect a job market moving close to full health and raise expectations that the Federal Reserve will start raising interest rates as soon as September. Okay, so understand that the conversation about raising interest rates is a separate conversation, and there are potential big downsides to if/when they end up raising the interest rates. What will the response be to that? Will there be another economic downturn? Will you pop the bubble, which is clearly a bubble yet again? How exactly will the economy respond when you do something like raise interest rates? We don't know. It's yet to be seen, but there are many experts who think, X-nay on the interest rate skay because this thing is a house of cards again. Now, that up to this point, it's actually so far so good. The news isn't bad. 5.3%, that's a 7-year low, 223,000 jobs created, rock and roll, everybody's throwing a fucking party. You should see the headlines all around the internet today. But here comes the bad news. Quote, the unemployment rate fell mostly because many people out of work gave up on their job searches and were no longer counted as unemployed. The percentage of Americans working or looking for work fell to a 38-year low, and average hourly pay was flat. Whoa. So not only is there a downside, there's a tremendous downside to the news from today. Okay, so perhaps the news is not as rosy as some are making it out to be. They say, quote, home sales are running at an 8-year high and boosting construction. Permits to build homes jumped 11.8% in May to the highest level since 2007. Okay, now this is one of those sneaky facts, because when a lot of people read that, a plain reading of that would be, okay, that's great. That means the housing market is on the rebound, and we should all be excited about that. Now, what's the downside of that? Articles that we've covered within the past year have demonstrated how most of the new property that's being bought up is not being bought up by, middle-class families or young people who are on the housing market and they're starting their lives and they're getting a mortgage and things like that. No, the purchases are being made by investment banks. The purchases are being made by Wall Street. So remember, the Great Recession was kicked off by a subprime mortgage crisis. So it was a housing issue. There was a gigantic problem there. So when everything went downhill and the government came in and bailed everybody out, well, then Wall Street turned around and said, okay, I got an idea. Let's make the economy look like it's healthier than it is and make a fuck ton of money by buying up all of the properties that were foreclosed on, and then we turn around and rent them back to the people who just lost their ability to own the house. So understand, when you hear something like that, at face value, it looks good. But in reality, it's actually a very, very scary fact, and it demonstrates the opposite of what you think it demonstrates. People would look at that and say, oh, rock and roll, we're back. But we're not back. Because you have the middle class and the poor in America. They're struggling tremendously. Now, we've covered the statistics before. From 1980 and onward, you've had wages stagnating for working people and for the middle class. That wasn't the case before then. Before then, from the New Deal until 1980, you had the middle class was getting a growing percentage of the wealth creation. Now, also, it's important to note that productivity during this time span has gone up consistently. So, in other words, the middle class and the poor are working just as hard as they've ever worked, and they're being incredibly productive, but they're not seeing the fruits of their labor. Why? Because the fruits of their labor are going to the rich. Why? Because the rich bought the government and rigged the policies in their favor. So it used to be that corporations and the rich carried a higher percentage of the tax burden, but now that's essentially been reversed. And now you have many more regressive taxes are becoming more popular, and it's a way to shift the tax burden from the rich and the corporations to the middle class and the poor. And then it makes it so that it's just another reason of many reasons why your wages are stagnant. Also, there's been a decline in unionization. We know that. There's been an all-out assault on the social safety net. So there's all these tremendous problems, a student loan debt crisis. Then we haven't even gotten into the derivatives issue on Wall Street, which is a totally separate issue, which could be another economic catastrophe in the waiting. So we have all these underlying systemic, fundamental problems with the economy. And it really does appear like we've put a Band-Aid over a gaping, gangrenous wound. Now, again, we covered it on yesterday's show, I think it was. There's a new report out from the economist Emmanuel Saez. He looked into who exactly is getting the money in the American economy. Come to find out that about 50% of the income generated in America is going to the top 10%. 50%, half the money is just going to 10% of the people. About 23% or 24% of the money is just going to the top 1%. Now, that's not sustainable. That's the most important point to make here. You can't keep that up because then the poor and the middle class no longer have the ability to buy the products that are made by these so-called captains of industry. So this much income inequality is bad for everybody in the system because eventually the system fucking blows up when it's this lopsided. Now, again, I hate to bring up stories that we did previously in the week, but remember, we haven't had this level of income inequality at any other time in history except for one period. The late 1920s. What happened in the late 1920s? The stock market crash and the Great Depression. So back then, it was 23%, 24% of the income was going to the top 1%. Everybody else was getting crumbs. Kaplooey, the system blew up, we had a depression. Today, it's 23%, 24% of the income going to the top 1%. What's going to happen? You tell me.